May God's grace, mercy, and peace be with you. Most of you are old enough to remember George Carlin, the stand-up comic. He had a gift for taking ordinary situations, even a single word, and exaggerating it so that it became brilliantly funny. Some of his material could be pretty raunchy, but he also had some deep insights about human behavior. In one of his monologues, he poked fun at our concern to accumulate things. You got your stuff with you, he said? I bet you do. Guys have stuff in their pockets, women have stuff in their purses. Stuff is important. You got to take care of your stuff. You got to have a place for your stuff. That's what life is all about. Trying to find a place for your stuff. That's all a house is, a place to keep your stuff. If you didn't have much stuff, you wouldn't need a house. You could walk around all the time. A house is just a pile of stuff with a cover on it. You can see that when you're taking off in an airplane. You look down and see all the little piles of stuff. Everybody's got his own pile of stuff. Well, you could say that the gospel reading today is about Jesus dealing with stuff. And what prompted Jesus to tell the parable was the request that he be a probate judge. Someone wanted help in dealing with a brother who apparently had charge of the family estate. But as we heard, Jesus refused to be pulled into that family dispute. The question, however, triggered his thoughts about money and stuff. One's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, he said. And then he tells the story about the farmer who had an extraordinarily good year. There are a lot of farmers in Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa and even down in Louisiana who would love to trade places with that farmer this year. The floods and high water this spring have delayed and prevented planting so that for many there will be a minimal harvest at best, and some will lose their land. They can't afford to keep it and make their payments. We do need stuff, wherewithal, simply to live in this society. I think of the daughter of a good friend of mine. She has a good job, good education, but her student debt is severely limiting her options. And how many around us, how many of us are strapped to make the mortgage payment, the car payment, pay for health insurance, food, prescriptions, fees for the kids to go to camp and take part in sports, and then the car breaks down or the water heater goes out. And some work 2, even 3 jobs trying to stay even. Some of the polls that measure happiness or satisfaction say that those who have $75,000 to $95,000 a year to live on feel emotionally content. You have to be the judge. Depends on your circumstance, of course. Jesus' parable also taps into a senior citizen anxiety. Will there be enough to carry me through the end of my life? I witnessed this anxiety in my father. He immigrated from Sweden just before the Great Depression hit. He didn't see a future in Sweden taking over his father's blacksmith shop and thought America would provide more economic options, which in the long run it did. But those really lean years in the 30s colored his outlook for the rest of his life. Will there be enough to cover all of those expenses of the later years? Will we indeed survive? The rich farmer of the parable obsessed over the anxiety of having enough. Jesus, I think, does not make any judgments per se here about money or wealth or material abundance. His concern is the farmer's greed, preserving it all for himself, building bigger barns. I think George Carlin's sarcasm is right on. So now you got a house full of stuff, and even though you might like your house, you got to move. Got to have a bigger house. Why? Too much stuff. That means you got to move all your stuff, or maybe put some of your stuff in storage. Storage. Imagine that. There's a whole industry based on keeping an eye on other people's stuff. Out of the corner of my eye on the way over here from the Heights this morning, I saw at least 6 storage complexes. In the parable, the farmer's problem is that his good fortune has curved his vision so that everything he sees starts and ends with himself. Our farmer has a conversation, but he talks only to himself. Did you catch it? I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store up all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. He's bought into the notion that the good life is having stuff for himself. But surprise, surprise, he would not have many years to enjoy the goods. His misplaced trust renders him a fool. And in the end, it wouldn't matter how much stuff he had. Underlying this gospel is a tension that we have long struggled with in America, and hence in the church in America. It's the tension between the individual and the community. Among our founders at the time of the Revolution, freedom was perhaps the most important value. Giving each person the freedom to pursue their own goals and become what they aspired to be is a main piece of our American identity. Of course, at the time of the Revolution, that included only Caucasians and Caucasian men. That freedom, including the freedom to make money, drew immigrants here. It fueled creativity. It energized entrepreneurs. In 1830, the French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville toured this country extensively. And then he wrote with admiration about our family life, our religious traditions, and our participation in local politics. He was anxious, though, about one aspect of our character, our extreme emphasis on the individual. He thought it might isolate Americans from one another and undermine the conditions of freedom. And we have witnessed examples of that ever since. If the individual has been the focus of our national history, the community is at the heart of the Bible's understanding of life. From the early pages of the Old Testament, God calls people together to be God's people. You cannot separate a person's relationship with God from that person's relationship with the community. The individual finds his or her identity, his or her understanding of who she is or who he is by being a member of the community. The community shapes and forms the individual. You capture that in your very name. And I encourage you to read those paragraphs from Pastor Paul in front of your announcement page, because he talks exactly about that, being a community. In the Gospels, Jesus calls a group of men. No women are in the group, but there's reference to women providing the funding for the operation. Jesus calls the men into a community of learners and followers. And the book of Acts describes how followers gathered to share their worship and their resources. If anyone had a need, the community took care of it. St. Paul gathered people into churches in the towns that he visited. And he lauds the churches in northern Greece for their generosity to other churches, even when they themselves were in dire straits. Jesus also makes it abundantly clear that the community that he calls us to by the Spirit is inclusive. Everybody is welcome. There's a place for you. And all those who have different backgrounds and different stories, they have gifts to contribute. You know, eyes must have rolled that day when Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, the alien, who dug into his own pockets to help the victim of violence. The body of Christ welcomes the stranger and serves those who hold a different faith or no faith at all. As I pondered this reading about greed and self-centeredness, the contrast of the generous community struck me. It made me think about the communities that have been important in my life and how important they were during the formative years. The one that stands out is the little Lutheran congregation smack in the middle of what now is the Silicon Valley. It wasn't called that when I was growing up. That congregation will be 100 years old next year. Some matchmakers there introduced my immigrant parents to each other. We had some stern pastors, but also some gentle Sunday school teachers and quiet folks who encouraged me at needed moments. A music director insisted that teenage boys can sing. There was even a bit of scholarship money donated by folks who didn't worry if they'd have enough. At Parish is where I learned faith. I have a hunch that's what's happening here at Community of Joy. Young people are learning faith, learning Jesus, as one creative writer put it. You're finding friendship and support and perhaps encouragement when doubts threaten to take over. As Luther said in his catechism, the Spirit brings us together to enlighten us, to make us holy, to join us to God. You have a role to play in the body of Christ simply by being the joyful community your name proclaims. So, stuff is important, but it doesn't get us the abundant life Jesus promises. That comes in the give and take of relationships in the community of faith. And all that happens under the umbrella of grace. St. Augustine once said that God gave us people to love and things to use. Sin is confusing those two things, turning them around, loving things and using people. If we sort out that confusion, we will have served God and our neighbor. Our God is a God who shares. Go and do likewise. That's really the bottom line of the gospel for the day. Amen.